That's fun. Lots of friends' faces here. This is great. All right. I'm going to wind up getting handed the host later, so I got to jump.
Yeah, you guys, 1 second, Hudson. I have an error on YouTube about the resolution. It's saying it's not supported. So I don't, all right, now it just popped in. So now we're good, I guess. Good to go.
We're live?
Just went live.
Just went live. We are live and rolling. And Rick, I have things are working for me for trading out later, so we're good.
Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome. We'll get this show on the road. We're going to take a bunch of questions, hopefully give some answers, or at least ponder those questions.
We'll ponder some questions. Yes, we will.
Well, first, just say we had a really wonderful time this last week here in the studio doing a printing workshop. We had 6 great folks here. And worked through a bunch of images, and I think people, including myself, got some new knowledge and new appreciation of printing and papers and types of printers. I had a blast. How about you, Rick?
Yeah, I had a great time. A lot of fun. We got workshop number 2 starting tomorrow. So
yep, Rick's going to finish this. Once I'm arrived from his home to LeGrand here for the workshop. Yep,
got a little bit of snow outside, and I'll be in the studio probably about 5 o'clock this afternoon. So we'll do it. We're planning on doing an ATS, sort of just talking about printing and that sort of stuff. And since we've been spending so much time printing, we've decided that the next office hours, which will be on March 7th, the main topic will be about printing. Right? We'll talk about printers, but we'll also, printing your own photos on your own printers and what printers are sort of cool out there right now. But we'll also talk about, what do you do if you don't want to spend money on a printer? So again, March 7th, you can ask questions. We'll probably get that up for questions starting,
today.
There you go. Woody says today. So.
Feel free, and there's no boundary on those questions. If you've never thought about printing and you're just curious about it, hit us up. And if you want to have someone else print for you, you want to send stuff off, what's the best way to do it? Any of those kinds of questions, we're happy to talk about getting your art up on the wall and in your hands, because I think we had a whole lot of lights come on with people here where they realized, holy cow, you see things differently in a print than you do on a computer screen. And you start realizing, wow, there are flaws I didn't even notice that I need to address to get this print looking right. And I actually think printing and holding your art on paper is the evolution of, photography. For me, at least, it has made me a significantly better photographer working to get ink right on paper. So whether you do it yourself or whether you send it out, it really can inform how you're shooting and editing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we've got a bunch of questions. I've got one that we're going to ask first, just because Hudson's got a little bit of show and tell. And this one's from Jeff Bentz. His topic was Z9 noise. And he says, I'm Z9 owner and have the 14 to 24, 24 120, 70 to 200, 100 to 400. Have been disappointed with the amount of noise in my images, especially with the 100 to 400. Is it possible I have some camera settings wrong or some import options that are not set correctly? He's shooting raw. But he says he seems like he can't go over 500 without noise in every lens. So,
it's funny. I'm just going to share my screen for a second, because one of the things about the Z9 that has really blown me away, and particularly shooting in Costa Rica with that 800 millimeter 6.3 in dark forests, was just how incredible its noise performance is for having nearly 50 megapixels. I take a look at this image of a howler monkey, and this is just the raw file shot at 2000 ISO, in order to get 200th of a second and freeze that motion. You can see the rain drips are blurred behind it. And if I zoom into 200 ISO, and I haven't even really touched a slider, I haven't fully finish edited this, that's not bad noise at 50 megapixels. I mean, I could go pull a couple sliders and completely eliminate that really easily. I had another image in this trip that, it was dark, and I had been photographing birds in flight and have my shutter set up a little differently. If I jump back to my grid view, this is one of my favorite images of the year this year. And I shot this one, I was shooting birds in flight, and all of a sudden this crocodile was swimming towards us through this reflection of the forest on the water and relatively low light. I'm wide open at 800 millimeters with that lens. And the image came out at 10,000 ISO, my favorite shot from it. I ran it through DxO's Pure Raw too. And, I have no problem at all with this 10,000 ISO image out of the Z9. So I don't think there's any import settings in Lightroom.
There is one thing,
ahead,
Sandy mentioned this, and I agree too. You have to be careful that you're not dealing with Lightroom's default sharpening options, because by default Lightroom applies some sharpening, and we know the whole thing about noise versus sharpening is a balance.
It is.
I would check to make sure that you're not getting your sharpening cranked up, and it's easy enough to fix. You could just turn it off and see what it looks like. But I agree with you. I mean, I noticed the same thing on my A1. That the noise performance for a 50 megapixel sensor was pretty amazing.
Stunning. Yeah.
So I definitely think if you're seeing what you think is noise at 500 ISO, then there might be something going on with the settings as well. I just check on that.
And that's an interesting point too, that 500 ISO on the Z9 happens to be the beginning of the second. It's a dual channel gain in the ISO. And that's actually sort of the base of the secondary channel of ISO. That 500 ISO setting has about the same noise equivalence as 120 ISO in the first channel. The first channel maximizes dynamic range at the expense of noise, knowing that you're mostly going to be shooting at those lower ISOs at really nice exposures, not too dark, not needing to brighten the shadows. And then when it goes to 500 and above, it jumps into a second channel where you lose dynamic range, but they assume you're working in low light and they work to maximize the noise performance. So it actually, I find the 500 ISO setting is one of the cleanest ISO channels in the camera. David, I was just going to ask David to unmute and see if
Yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah. So it might be that there's some sharpening going on, or there's not enough noise. Maybe the noise reduction is completely off when you import it.
Could be.
But
when I'm
there are
out doing
ways to
nature,
set it. You can also, in Lightroom, you can set the settings for things like noise by default in the preferences, so that when you import a Z9 photo, it has lower sharpening and has a different noise reduction setting.
I've never changed the default. I know that Nikon throws a little bit of profiling in there, and I've always been relatively happy with it, unless I'm going to print big, at which point, if I'm getting bigger than 13 by 19, I'm going to go in and adjust the noise to my preference zoomed into 100%. Otherwise, for digital representation and smaller prints, I almost never touch it.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, this one is kind of a question and more of a discussion thing from our buddy Al, who said, the question is basically, why are the rules so constraining for photo competitions? He just got disqualified from a competition in the documentary category because he submitted a long exposure of the night rocket launch and was told that a long exposure doesn't represent a moment in time that would be typical for a journalist. He countered with, I define a moment in time.
Yeah,
and so his question is, why are the rules so different? Why are they so antiquated? What are they trying to do? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it really is sort of, you know, how do you think about photo competitions today? So,
I mean, and this has been an issue since the dawn of photography, right? What's real, what's not real, what's manipulated, what's not manipulated. Should you be masking and doing all the things that they used to do in the dark room to sharpen? And finally, you know, it boils down to the fact that whenever you have a group of people running anything, whether it's a competition or a publishing house, there's gonna be some personal bias in the rules that are promulgated. And in this case, it seems really strange. I think most of us have seen Al's quite amazing, multiple minutes long images of these launches from SpaceX and NASA down there. And they're wonderful. And, you know, I mean, who's to say that a photograph that the camera's shutter is open for multiple minutes is somehow disqualified? I mean, what is it only okay from 1/8,000th of a second to less than a second? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But apparently whoever promulgated that rule has that bias, and human bias is one of those things we'd love to get rid of.
It's hard to avoid bias in some ways. The question is whether the bias photo competitions in general, especially today on the web. We were talking about this earlier, and it's like, you know, I don't enter my photos in any photo competition online. I just don't. But I understand why people want to do that. And I'm not saying that they're bad, but I feel as though the photo competition world these days is all about the people who are putting on the competition. They're not truly, you know, judged or curated in a way, for most of them, that you know, we would think they should be curated. And if I were going to enter any photo competition today, the first thing I would do is go and download the rules. You know, there should be a very good selection, or a section on the website that talks about what are the criteria for submitting images, who owns the images. You know, it's like you should always be looking at these and make sure that, you know, by the act of submitting your image, you're not giving them rights to use your image in perpetuity.
That's a really important point that Rick makes. I saw photos, you know, they do the travel books. I saw a contest they put out: submit as many images as you want for free. We'd like them full resolution. And if you win, they have one grand prize winner who's going to get their photo on the cover of a Photos travel book and a free trip anywhere in the world. And then when you read the fine print, it gave Photos the permission to use any image submitted in any publication that they want and to resell to any stock agency that they want.
Right.
You're like, wow, holy cow. So be careful to read those little fine print sections.
Well, and the other thing is that there should be something that talks about either the overarching, how do they select images, or the different categories, how do they submit them, how do they judge those, what are the criteria for that category. I mean, a good, well thought out competition should have very clear rules for each category. They should.
Right.
You know, I know that, like, say, Outdoor Photographer does photo contests quite frequently, and their rules have generally been very clear about what you can submit and what you can't. And if you look at it and it says, we're sorry, no long exposures in this category, then I think you can agree to disagree that maybe that should be. But, you know, what Al's talking about sounds like an arbitrary, you know, well, we decided this isn't what this should be. But, you know, I don't, as long as you understand that what most of these sort of web-based photo contests are not really curated in any real way, and that their primary goal is to showcase whoever's putting these things on, not necessarily your work, or
my favorite type of photo contest is rarer and rarer these days, but it's where you submit prints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's a serious photo competition, to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 years ago, here in my little town, we've got an art center that does classes, and they've got a gallery, and they do curated shows. And every year at the end of the year, they have a show that is juried. And, I've submitted photos for it a couple of times since I've lived here. And one time I got stuff in, another time I did not. And, and last year, I was looking through the rules, and the rules stated that the photograph had to be, or the artwork had to be done in the year 2022. And I was like, I had some images from 2021 that I really liked that I didn't really edit to final work until 2022. But I don't, I was like, okay, technically I can't submit. That bother me. I don't know, maybe a little bit, but not in a huge way,
Right.
But I much prefer sort of physical juried shows over the stuff that I see on the web these days. And no, I'm not saying that there aren't. When digital started, National Geographic used to do a really good job of sort of curated competitions, but I feel like they're not, they've kind of lost their way on that regard. So.
Well, they changed ownership pretty massively.
So
yeah, they're different organizations.
So okay.
Right. Eat that one a bit.
Say,
it was good.
Darren, you said that there was a question over there about, we were talking about the noise thing in Z9 earlier. There was a question for Hudson.
Yeah, Hudson, when you were doing all that stuff in Costa Rica, were you shooting in auto ISO, or were you controlling that every time?
Absolutely. When I shoot wildlife, sports, action, my default these days is manual mode with auto ISO, and I'm watching the ISO. The only thing I have to keep my eye on really is ISO and shutter speed. And suddenly if you notice that you're at 26,000 ISO, you go, oh, I must have bumped aperture up for some reason and forgot to run it back down. You keep your eye on all those, but I wouldn't have gotten that crocodile image if I hadn't been in auto ISO, because I was shooting birds up in the sky and the trees, and all of a sudden there was this instant where this crocodile's coming toward me, and it was snap down, shoot, and the auto ISO jumped up to 10,000 and got me the shot. So.
All right. Mark Hen asked a question that's Nikon specific, but it's actually, I can speak to it on the Sony side as well. Are there any differences between regular and silent mode on Nikons that impacts image quality? I'm assuming what he means there is mechanical shutter versus electronic, but
on the older Nikons, the older mirrorless Nikons, let's talk about, there are and even the DSLRs, there's more potential for what's called rolling shutter at certain shutter speeds, and there was always an automatic choice. You could choose for it to automatically select between silent and electronic, and I would
rolling shutter with respect to electronic shutter.
Right. Fast moving subjects might appear warped because with the electronic versus the mechanical. I feel like they pretty well nipped that with the Z9. They didn't include a mechanical shutter. If you go silent with the Z9, it just turns a little speaker off that emulates the sound of a shutter. There is no shutter. So with the Z9, what they did was just built the processing into the chip where it's so ridiculously fast that they don't have much issue with it. And that's probably the future where we're heading with all the brands and all the cameras. I would imagine it's expensive to put a mechanical shutter assembly in there. That's the thing that tends to break over time with lots of usage. So it makes sense eventually that we're probably going to have a lot more cameras without shutters as we move into the next decade of camera design. I have not had much issue personally. Let's say you're shooting a wedding or birds or something where you just wildlife and you don't want to disturb them by flipping into silent mode, I haven't noticed much issue with that. But in general, I just left it in automatic with my cameras, and I just haven't even researched it that much because I didn't have any problem with it.
Yeah, and on the Sony side, that when the A1 came out, which still has a mechanical as well as an electronic shutter, the processor in the A1 virtually eliminated rolling shutter. And that's actually one of the things that I got back on the negative side when I purchased the A7R5 and sold the A1. But again, for the type of stuff that I shoot, rolling shutter is not an issue. I don't shoot video, and I'm not really shooting fast moving subjects. And it's a real easy thing to see when it happens, which is I saw a great illustration on DP Review of some guy drumming, and the shot with mechanical shutter, it's just frozen perfectly, but on the electronic shutter, the drumsticks are kind of drooping as the shot was taken with the electronic shutter. So,
perfect example. Or like the cars stretch.
Yeah.
Or a propeller, right? A propeller being all weird instead of being a uniform circle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So the way that they're making it possible with the A1 and the Z9 is that stacked sensor, where the sensor is actually a processor in and of itself. And so they don't have to send that data off to a processor away from the chip. It's being done so quickly on the sensor itself that there's not as much of an issue. It's like having a mechanical shutter.
Yeah. All right. Richard Horn asks about a multi-purpose tripod for uses from interior architecture to extreme telephoto for sports and wildlife.
Just so
How did I know?
The tall fluid head does it all. You want to shoot action like a gimbal. I mean, yeah, it's nice to have a completely separate, 3-4 pound gimbal in the bag that you can switch out for work with a long lens, but drop your long lens foot in here and it does sort of turret style long lens work no problem, and it holds my 800 and Z9 just fine. You want to do architecture or landscape, it's so precise. You get it level with its leveling base. You can make minor adjustments left, minor adjustments up and down. It's super precise. When you hit that lock, it doesn't move an iota when you're done with it. I mean, panoramas, you level it, you can tilt and pan level. I mean, I don't know. It does everything for me. That's the all-in-one. You can go over to hudsonhenry.com/tripods and there's videos about why I think so. But that's the one I use whenever I am okay carrying a little under 7 pounds with me. There's situations where I need something to be a little bit lighter, but that's certainly not the situation when you're going to carry a gimbal and a ball head and this thing does it all. So, and more people I know are carrying them and agreeing with me. So I don't have any complaints yet so far after selling hundreds of them. So.
All right. So we just did an ATS on stabilization, and we have a bunch of questions about stabilization this week.
Well, that's kind of why I did the ATS on it. Is I've just been seeing, I think a lot of people are moving into mirrorless, and now they've got in-body image stabilization, and then they've got lens stabilization, and they kind of knew the rules in the DSLR age, and they're wondering, well, what are the rules now in the mirrorless age? But Rick and I just did a video about it on YouTube, and you can go and check that out. It's like 9 or 10 minutes. It's a short one. But I'll cut to the chase, which is that in a modern camera and in modern lenses, the camera knows whether it's locked down on a tripod or it knows whether you're bouncing around and moving with it. And you just never really need to turn it off because it's smart enough to know not to mess the image up when it's locked down. I never turn mine off.
Nope. Nor do I.
And the only other caveat to that is with Nikon, there's still that that sport or action. I think it's sport mode in the image stabilization versus normal. And sport mode is really for bouncing along on the back of a moped while someone else is driving, trying to get a shot of that celebrity in the car. You know,
Yeah.
it's or you're in the back of a pickup truck and there's racers running around you and you're bouncing in the truck tied in and you're moving and everything's moving. It's the like image stabilization on steroids. I would not leave that turned on the tripod. I personally I've only used it once, which actually was that situation. I was in the back of a truck getting shots of off-road trucks racing through rough territory, and we were all bouncing all over. And I was like, well, finally I have a chance to use sport mode. And that's the only time I've ever done it. So
I use it in kayak a good bit.
Oh, David uses it in the kayak. Yeah. Well, that was another question we had on this ATS. What about when you're shooting from a rolling boat in waves with birds and moving subjects? That's another great time. Yep. Turn up the image stabilization to active. Absolutely. And keep a fast enough shutter speed and check your shots and make sure that they're sharp. Yeah. Good call.
All right. And watch that ATS. We probably should put a link in both the YouTube feed and in the chat service. But if you go to the ATS page on YouTube, it's like right up at the top. Video. Yeah. Okay. So a couple of questions about the case filters.
We had someone ask if they were good for Sony and what size I would recommend. And I will just say, yeah, they're good for every brand. They're really high quality glass. They're very durable. They're light. They're thin. They stack.
And on the Sony side, the 82 I think is really the one you need.
So and I only carry in stock 82 and 112, and there's a reason for it. Well, one is, I'm not B&H, so I can't stock. I carry a wide stock of everything in my store, and I get supplied from the exact same distributor as B&H and Amazon, who lives right here in my town. So things are very quick, and he's on a friend basis. So the 82 really works well for most lenses because you can step it down. And, even if your biggest lens right now is a 77, I wager that your camera brand of choice is likely to build a lens that you love in the not so distant future that's 82. And then all your filters won't work with that new lens.
Right.
And if your wide angle optic of choice is 77 millimeters and you mount the holder and a 77 millimeter filter on it, you may well see that filter when you're all the way wide with that lens. Say you're 20 millimeter or you're 24 to 70. And so going out to 82 for your creative, expensive filters is just a great idea to future-proof yourself and to avoid vignetting. And then you can stack filters. The new Eclipse that we're getting ready to run a workshop for in 2024, the main filters people bought were 16 stop neutral density to shoot the sun in the phases before it goes to totality. Well, you can just stack a 10 and a 6, click with these filters, and you've got an Eclipse filter in front of your camera. I'm stacking all the time, and it's not brand dependent at all. I carry the 112s because those work so well for the Nikon system with that 112 millimeter lens hood that they send out with the 14 to 24 S lens, but it fits on the 14 to 30, the 14 to 24, the 24 to 72.8, the 70 to 200 the 50 1.2, and I'm hoping the 85 1.2 that I'm waiting on. You just leave a magnetic ring mounted in that hood and click, the filters drop in, and you just twist a quarter click snap, it's on the front of your lens. It's awesome. So those are the two sizes I carry. If anybody wants custom sizes, hit me up. We can get them in a day. If you want 95 set, just let me know. Boom, we'll get them. But I think that for most people, 82 and 112 are the choice. If you're a Nikon shooter and you have any of those Holy Trinity lenses, the 2.8 zooms, you should be using them. They're amazing.
So Eileen, I use the 82s on my Sony lenses. That's what makes sense for me. So I think it would be the same for you. And then Ken asked about the difference. There's a new Revolution model that's out. over
Yep.
the expensive, or over the Wolverine. And then there's a Sky Eye model, and he's like,
I'm not a fan of the Sky Eye. The Sky Eye is a magnetic filter with threads on the outside so that you can stack a traditional filter on the end of it. And that just gets you back to the same old thick filtered vignetting problem that we're avoiding with these ultra thin. I mean, I can stack my 3, 6, and 10 filters, and they're about the same size as one of my old Hoya Solus ND filters. You know, they're very, very thin. They can sit in one slot in my filter pouch together, all 3 of them. And that lets you stack without vignetting. You go to the Sky Eye, you lose all those benefits. Plus, you can't keep putting magnetic ones on top because now you have this threaded ring on the outside. So the Sky Eye, they tried to you know, they sent me those, wanting me to be excited about them, and I was like, no, these are exactly what I'm trying to get away from. The Revolution is the future of the case filter system. I just got a test set. They're going to be coming. They're exactly the same glass. They're exactly as durable as they used to be. They have this neat color-coded set of rings that are on the outside of the filter, so you can tell at a glance one from another without reading them. That's really nice. And I think the magnet is marginally stronger in them. I don't have that. Nobody has the 112s yet. The 82s are starting to come out. I'm starting to have a limited ability to get those. I can't get. Nobody has night filters yet or UVs. They have the polarizers and the 3, 6, 10 neutral density and that limited kind of kit or individual filters that would go in that kit. It's very, very new. And as I said, I've just had time to test them to say they're optically and durably the same. They're the same glass. If you want 77, 82, well, if you want 82 in particular, I think 77, 82, and 95 are filtering out. I'm hoping that 112s are coming soon. If you want to wait for those color-coded, slightly stronger magnets, you know, I'll be getting them soon. The others, again, optically the same. There's not functionally that much difference. So it's not like you're really missing out with the older ones.
okay. Any questions you have over there on YouTube, Darren?
Yeah, so question for I guess really all 3 of you, David, Rick, Archer, Hudson.
Rick Archer. What?
Rick Archer.
That's an outrage.
When you go and you ingest your photos, do you format your cards every time, or not? And what are the pros, cons to doing it that way?
I'll go first really quick. I always used to download my photos and format my cards. With my older Nikons, I had the user mode settings that are sticky. You know, you had to slip your dial into U1 and the memory of all those settings was internal in the camera. In the Z9, when you do that, when you format your card, it wipes out the saved settings, which is all of your menu settings from the camera, which are stored to the card. And the banks that you've set up, all your kind of basic, here's where I want the camera to be when I pick it up at the beginning of the day, are stored in my saved settings. So I'm very careful. I don't always format my card. I sometimes just go to delete all, but I try once every 3 or 4 times. I make sure I format it because it's just good for the health of your memory card and file system to format it occasionally. And my methodology that I've developed for doing that with this camera with the banks is to go into my menu where I have save and load camera settings, and I load my camera settings. So I have my sort of basic setup that I want, that I have saved as my beginning profile. It's that this is how I want my camera to be when I take it out of the bag. I load those, format the card, save those. If I don't do that order, then I've lost that copy of my settings on my card. It's just going to be all over the board how I've changed it for that particular shoot I was doing. But I think it's a good idea to format your card on a pretty regular basis. You just have to take care, if you're a Z9 shooter, which I know a lot of you are, to load those important camera settings so that you're at that place you want to be, then format your card, then save them back to the card so you have it again. It's silly. It shouldn't be. It's a mistake of Nikon to set it up that way, but that's how it is. Rick, do you format your card every time?
No, I do not. Well, most of the time I have multiple cards. Like when I go on a workshop, I do not format anything once the workshop starts. When my card fills, I go on to another card. I haven't yet gotten to the point where I made it a third card, but I have a third card. I reformat when I've been back from a trip or I've had a full card and I know that all of my images have been imported and backed up into multiple places. And then before I go, like, so, next month we're going to be going to Charleston. What I will do before that Charleston trip is I will go through my memory cards, make sure that I have everything in my Lightroom catalog, and then those are then backed up into the cloud and onto my alternative drives. And then I will format everything. So I've got a completely full set of cards or an empty set of cards.
You better bring all your cards when you come here.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to fill them up.
I do something similar. To Rick, but I still format my card at the end of the day. I move my card. I have 2 hard drives on this laptop that I travel with. They're both fast NVMe drives, and one is a 2 terabyte data drive. And I put all my photos into that drive in a folder called road data. And then at the end of the night, after I've been culling and sorting and deleting, I plug this slow spinning 4 terabyte old school hard drive into my laptop, and I have syncing software that just makes sure that it's synced exactly to that road data folder on my computer. So everything goes onto this. And if I keep editing and culling and deleting, it's an incremental sync software I use called Good Sync. It'll see what's deleted off this drive. All I have to do is while I go to bed at night, this thing's syncing in the background. And then I keep these in 2 separate bags so that if I lost my computer, I'd still have all the data. If I lost this, I'd still have my computer. So, and that way I
have that as well. I have another external hard drive that my card gets copied to when I import it into Lightroom. I just back everything up. So I'm pretty crazy about making sure that I've got multiple copies of images from a card.
And I'm slack. It can't happen to me.
No, you just drop cameras into water.
Yeah, that's what you do. Yeah. How is that CNET, by the way, Dave?
It flows.
Rob asks about dealing with a crop sensor APS-C mode. Well, actually, I'm not quite sure. He says, it's often been said that when dealing with a crop sensor, such as an APS-C, that is not only the crop factor applied, but to the focal length of the lens, but also to the aperture. With regards to crop factor affecting the aperture, is it specifically in relation to the depth of field, or does it also impact the light gathering capability of the lens?
Okay.
I.e., will a f2.8 lens on a crop sensor be just as fast as an f2.8 on full frame? I know you love this question.
This is one of my traditional rant topics, because whoever started talking about how crop sensor somehow affects the aperture of a lens, it confuses people. And I understand what they were thinking when they said it, but it confuses people. And I will just start with the basic statement that what a lens does is it projects an image, a round image, a specific distance behind it where the sensor happens to be. And whether you put a large sensor there or a small sensor there, the projection that lens creates does not change. It doesn't, right? If you have a lens that fits on a full frame body and also fits on a APS-C body, as we have with, say, a Nikon Z50 and a Nikon Z7, the sensor is the same distance behind that same lens that at the same aperture projects the same image circle. You're just cropping a smaller square out of the center of it, the sweet spot of the lens. And so you have the same exact light gathering capability, and you have the same exact focal depth of field of a say 100 millimeter 2.8 on APS-C or on full frame. You're just cropping an image that is equivalent to if you put a 150 millimeter lens onto the full frame camera from a filling the frame with your subject perspective. You cropped in, so the subject is a larger portion of the captured area. You know, if you had a deer that's off in a field in front of you, well, you're going to have a larger image of the deer with the crop sensor, because it cropped the middle of that lens's projection out. When they start talking about the effective aperture, what they're saying is, but the aperture won't look the same as if you'd used a 150 millimeter lens. You're using a 100 millimeter lens. So in order to get an equivalent aperture of a 150 2.8, you would need a 100 1.8. You see, so that's they're talking about these kind of like, well, the way that an image looks from a longer lens on full frame isn't going to be, but the projection of the lens that you're using doesn't change no matter what sensor you crop a square out of it. It's 100s, a 100s, a 100s, a 100. That's kind of the same principle that they use to give you the equivalent of, say, a 28 millimeter lens with your cell phone by using a 6 millimeter lens on this tiny little sensor inside. And a 6 millimeter lens has infinite depth of field. So the cell phone doesn't ever really need to focus, and it does blurring through computational photography with a razor sharp 6 millimeter image that you're shooting with. So sensor size has no effect on focal length of a lens, of its principal characteristics of depth of field or light gathering capability. It just doesn't equate exactly to what the longer lens on a larger sensor would look like. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And so people that have discussed this whole effect on aperture, it confuses people. They somehow think that by taking this lens and unmounting it from my Z9 and mounting it onto my Z50, it's not going to have the same f4 light gathering capability or the same f4 depth of field, but it will. It's just that, you know, at 100 millimeters on the Z9, it's going to give me sort of the reach of a 150, or on the Z50, the smaller sensor. It'll give me the reach of a 100 millimeter or 150 millimeter because of the 1.5 crop factor on the Z9. And yeah, if I put a 150 millimeter on the Z9, it would have a shallower depth of field because it's 150 millimeter. That's a principle of the lens, not the sensor.
Right.
And so by conflating this whole thing, it just confuses everyone. And the reality is that projection doesn't change, just doesn't change.
Okay. Nailed it. Darren, you said you had another question?
Yeah, we had another one come in, this time from Jeff, talking about importing settings in Lightroom, right? Are there any preferences or presets we should use? Adobe default or the camera settings, and then pick what camera I'm working with? What do you guys do when you're importing?
You go first.
I import Adobe standard because that's the neutral. I shoot on the camera in neutral so that I'm not applying any sort of picture profile to my images, so that what I see on the back of the screen is going to be as close to what I'm going to see in the raw. I don't change it for different cameras at all. You know, just I want my workflow to be based on a flat or neutral profile.
And I echo that 100%. I choose the flat or neutral profile in Nikon to get the best approximation of the raw file, both in the JPEG that it renders and in the histogram that it renders, because it uses those profile settings to create a little JPEG of that raw data, and it's that JPEG's histogram that you're looking at. So if you choose vivid, it's going to look like highlights and shadows are blown out that aren't really blown out in the raw file. And then, you know, when the whole craze came out with LUTs and profiles, I dabbled around and played with all the different potential settings that you could use. And I just kept coming back to the fact that when I'm in Adobe, I like the Adobe standard profile. It just looks better in general to me. And I I'm used to working with it, and it does, like Rick said, create this consistency across all my cameras, you know, whether I'm shooting with my Leica Q2 or my Nikon Z50 or the Z9 or playing around with one of Rick's Sonys and bringing the files in. It gives me a pretty similar file to work with. And so
it's all about expectations, right?
mm-hmm.
If you're shooting,
but other people might have a different workflow. It's fine.
Yeah, but still, if you're shooting in Vivid on your camera, what you're seeing in Vivid is basically the JPEG that's been created from that raw file, so you can see something. Right. And then that's what you expect to see when you import it into Lightroom. And depending on how you set your preview generation, that Vivid image could be the preview image until you go into develop, when it will generate a one-to-one preview of the actual raw file.
Yeah.
But I had this in a workshop last year where, you know, they're like, well, I look at all my in Lightroom when I import them and they're all beautiful and brightly colored. And then when I go into develop, it's like, it's a whole different image. And it's like, well, that's what happens. You know, you're not generating any previews when you import it. And then it's not until you go into develop when the real raw file is revealed.
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
It was like, oh, you know,
yeah.
I mean, and that was, you know, one of the things that came out in the print workshop is just, you know, people, you know, there's it's not so much a lack of understanding, it's as much as it's people don't really deal with this the way we used to deal with prints, in that, you know, what you see on the screen is a different transmission medium than what print on paper is, and they will look different. Question is, how do you get that balance between the two?
Absolutely.
There are a couple of questions about spoolography.
Oh yeah.
Basically, people wanting to know, you know, should they be waiting for the next version? You know, the Spoolography 2, which was supposed to be out by now and was supposed to work on my Sony camera, but, you know, so you got any thoughts? I mean, Jim says, you know, should I wait for the Kickstarter deliveries or just buy the earlier version until my version 2 arrives later in the year, hopefully?
Yeah, I haven't reached out to Oliver for a while. They're a small team in Germany, and I know they do good work, and I know they mean well. They've been very slow. I personally just haven't felt much of a need for them since we got the extended shutter speeds in the Z cameras. You know, now that I can dial in 900 seconds on my camera, I'm less concerned about it. I loved using it for long exposure work because it was so small and so subdued. You know, it's like you didn't even notice it was there inside your hull bracket, such a tiny little thing. Now that I use the Z9 so much, it has a totally different connector. I'd have to get a 10-pin adapter with a cord that wraps around to it sticking into the USB. And it just, I haven't missed it since I got extended shutter speeds into my camera. And so, you know, between using the SnapBridge app and the included extended shutter speeds that go up to 15 minutes long, I just don't use it much. There's another great app. It's very affordable that you can connect to your camera directly via Wi-Fi called QDSLR. And I don't know if it works for Sony. I know it works for Canon.
Yeah, I think it does actually.
Does it? Yeah, it's an amazing. Its user interface is a little more complicated and old school, but it has a lot more power. And I use it for bulb ramping time lapses where I can tell it, you know, to ramp shutter speed, then ramp aperture, then ramp ISO, and I can control how it does that and watch and make adjustments while it's happening for, say, doing day to night time lapse. I mean, it's very, very sophisticated. But it's complicated enough that you need to actually connect to your camera's Wi-Fi and turn off your data connection to your phone so that its only connection is to your camera. But it's cool. If you want some of those functionalities, it's pretty amazing. Your cell phone can do everything with a Wi-Fi connection to your camera. and again, you know, Rick just got the A7R5. That's got the extended shutter speeds. One of the things you wanted, right, was extended shutter speeds, like Nikon's been doing. And, you know, to speak to just how great Nikon has been with firmware updates, they retroactively added those extended shutter speeds to the older cameras when they came up with it for the newer cameras via firmware, which
that was just the Z7 6 and 7 II models, though, correct? I don't believe it.
I can't remember.
I don't think it was. I remember that. I
think
when
you're right. I think
Z6.
they were able to pass save focus position down to the original cameras, which was cool, but they may have had some limitation on its processing or what. But yeah, they did pass it back to older cameras when it came out in the Z9, which I thought was awesome. So it might just be the Z6 II and Z7 II. If you have the original Z6 and Z7, I don't know that you're going to get that much waiting on the Fullography 2, but then again, your next camera upgrade, whether it's a Z6 II or a Z8 or, you know, whatever it might be, it's probably going to have those extended shutter speeds, you know, the 900 seconds. And at that point, you just dial it in on the camera. And you'd think that would be onerous, having 900 seconds in the setting, but because it goes in thirds of a stop, you go, you know, 600 seconds, 900 seconds, like click, click, you know, it's like they ramp up bigger and bigger. And so it's pretty cool. I leave those turned on all the time.
Okay. Paul asked a question in the Zoom chat. How critical is level? As I'm seeing that sometimes I may level the base on the tripod and the top of the nodal or panning clamp, it does not seem to be level for the entire 360-degree rotation. Is it just the engineer in me getting critical?
It's just the engineer. The engineers always worry about this. And the reality, you know, there are set screws driving from your leveling base into the base of your tripod, and they may not be perfectly adjusted. There may be some slight throw from that. The ARCA clamps that we use might grab more on one side than the other and rotate a little bit. If you're doing panoramas and your concern is about the level on your panorama, well then level at the head. There's on the Manfrotto 500AH, there's a bubble level right here in the center underneath. If you tilt the camera, lock it, and have a look down, you can level on the bubble level right there. That's the one to level on, because then your rotation point is level. That's the one that matters. You know, wherever it is that you're panning, that's where you want to get level. It doesn't matter as much if it's level up on your LRP3 level. It matters that your pan is level right here. So I try to level on the head. If you're using the panorama head from Acrotech, it has a nice big bubble level right in the center over its rotation. We had a person asking a question, well, can't you just use the GXP or the GXP SS inverted with the panning mechanism on the top for panoramas? Well, you can, as long as you're level. You can't really tilt and do that with a ball head. That's the ball head's regret, essentially. The minute you tilt, you're panning like a rainbow up and down. The beauty of these heads, whether it's the panorama head or the fluid head, is that you can tilt and still pan level while tilted. But if you did do that, you would want to level on that panning point, the up at the top. All of a sudden, wherever you're panning, that's the part you want level.
Okay. Darren, you've got another question over on YouTube?
Yeah, around wildlife and sports and super telephoto, right? So they've already got a 7200Z, but they don't have a longer lens for Z yet. And some friends have suggested get an FTZ and an F mount instead. Hudson, what are your thoughts there? I anticipate your answer is if you can afford to get the 100 to 400 or something like that, you should, because it's ridiculous, and I would agree with that. But in a pinch, what would you go for?
I think that the last couple of great F mount long lenses inside the stratosphere, let's ignore the the 600 f4 and some of those crazy lenses of the past, that were the 500 PF, the 300 PF, and the 70 to 200 FLED, which they don't need because they already have the 70 to 200S, which is incrementally better than that lens. The problem is that the older, longer lenses are older designs, and the new mount, the shorter flange distance from the back of the lens to the sensor, and the wider opening, not having to bend the light rays as much to get it all the way out to that full frame sensor, just really opened up the design parameters for the optical engineers, and the lenses are just better. They're shockingly better, with the exception, I think, of those 3 pieces of glass in my experience. And so, if you can afford it, the 100 to 400, if you can find it, the 1.4 teleconverter is your friend. I think the 2.0
they're starting to come into play, by the way.
Yeah. And the 400 4.5 is an amazing little lens. It's actually, I think, smaller and lighter than the 70 to 200, and it's just an incredible lens, and it'll take the 1.4 without an issue. It probably takes the 2.0 all right. Both, but the 1.4 for sure. There hasn't been a bad piece of S-Glass that I've seen yet. Let's just put it that way. And even the non-S-Glass is surprisingly good.
Yeah, I think Tom Hogan had a thing on the S-Glass recently, and his take was basically all but maybe one lens that Nikon has come out with has been not even subpar, but just not as good as some of the stuff on the F mount. So
wait.
He's saying that most of the S-Glass is great, is what he's saying.
Yeah, better.
Yes,
yeah.
better. Yes. And there was a side question that someone had about the 1.4 versus the 2.0. They can buy one. They're thinking, well, why shouldn't I buy the 2.0? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Say that one more time. Side issue.
There was a question about, just about working with teleconverters and the Nikon S mount specifically was, why shouldn't I buy the 2.0? Because it'll give me twice the reach instead of the 1.4.
You lose more light for one thing.
You lose a lot of light. It slows on a lot of lenses. It really slows down autofocus. I was really unhappy with the 2.0 on the 100 to 400. I was okay with it on the 70 to 200. It's surprisingly better than I thought it was going to be, but I'd still any day rather shoot with the 100 to 400 over the 2.0 on the 70 to 200. It's just the focusing is faster. It's easier to get nice sharp images. It wasn't mind-bendingly different, but the 100 to 400 is just more versatile and easier. I hate switching constantly to get all the range that I want. The 2.0 teleconverters traditionally have been built for the big, exotic, heavy telephotos used by bird, wildlife, and sports pros. The 300 2.8, the 600 f4, the 400 2.8 lenses, the exotics that cost 5 figures are designed to be able to be doubled. And like David's 400 2.8, I'm sure if you slap the 2.0 teleconverter on that, it would be a beautiful 800 f5.6.
Yeah, and it worked really well, and I use it all the time.
Yeah.
With the 2.0.
But, I mean, you got to drop $13,000 on the lens that teleconverter is really designed to be optimal with. I don't think it's going to be nearly as good on the 400 4.5. I mean, it's probably not awful on the S-Glass just because the S-Glass is so good. In the F-mount days, you wouldn't have wanted to do it. You don't want to see what happens when you put the 2.0 teleconverter on the 500 PF. Not to mention it's tough to shoot a 1,000mm lens, but the quality isn't there. You put the 1.4 teleconverter on it and it's great. Same could be said of the 300. The 300 was not a good 600 with the old TC2 teleconverter. It was great with the 1.4, but not the 2.0. I really think the 2.0s are made for the big fast glass. And again, I was surprised it was decent on the 70 to 200, but I'd say decent, not amazing.
I can, for the four of us in the office hours who shoot Sony, I can say that with, for all of the main Sony FE glass, the 2.0 teleconverter just isn't worth it. The 1.4 is the way to go.
Yeah. I would say the same thing for Nikon. That I tested them both and sent the 2.0 back.
Yep. Okay. Well, there we go. We've wasted another hour of everyone's perfectly good time. We apologize for that.
That we'll never get back.
And so we'll see you on the 7th of March. The sign up page is already there. Ask your printer questions. You can ask other questions as well, but we'll deal with the printing stuff first, and then we'll move on to whatever's left over. Thanks to
thanks
Darren.
Everybody for sending in such great questions. This was a good diverse hour of discussion. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun.
Yep.
Thanks to David and Darren and Rick and Woody, who had to take off a little early, and everybody here. It's been a blast. So
yep.
We'll see you all in a few weeks, and we'll see some of you tomorrow in the printing workshop.
Yep.
All right, everybody.
Take care.